Trump's tax reform plan continues to move through Congress, and although there's no guarantee yet that it'll pass both houses and then be signed into law by President Trump, there is already widespread doubt about how effective it will be. The critics say we have seen this kind of plan time and time again, and it has failed. Here is former longtime AP newsman Bryant Thomas to explain.
Bryant, a familiar clarion is being sounded out of the Trump administration, and it sounds a heck of a lot like trickle-down economy that we've heard a number of times before. What's your take on that?
Well, I think they're just warming it up again, and they're going to try to make it work. They insist that this works for the lower and middle class people when those at the top have this extra money, that all of it flows down to the lower class people. And over the years, there are plenty of indications that this really doesn't happen, that economic activity is created when investors think there's an opportunity to make money with a business or some sort of mechanical economic tool, rather than having a windfall from a tax cut.
For those who may not be familiar with Trickle Down, basically, what's the idea behind it?
Well, the idea is that if you give extra money to higher income people, the people who are most likely to be entrepreneurs and owners of businesses and speculators who would engage in starting new businesses, that they will have all of this extra money to troll around with and look for opportunities to make money in the private sector.
By extra money, we're talking about tax cuts for the high income brackets.
Correct. That's all it is. These people are the ones who need to have the economic stimulus money available to them to create the jobs of the future. That's always been the claim of the supply side people, and there's plenty of indication that that really doesn't happen.
It sounds good, at least in theory. You cut taxes, people are able to invest more, create more jobs, and in aggregate, there's more tax money coming in, more revenue. That's the argument, isn't it? What's wrong with that?
It doesn't occur. David Stockman even admitted that in the tax cuts in the first year of the Reagan presidency, that they cut the taxes whoppingly down to 28% from the top income bracket, and they didn't have any commensurate and concurrent cuts in spending. So what they wound up with was huge deficits because the economic activity that was supposed to occur with these tax cuts lagged, and I mean lagged by years, almost to the end of the Reagan presidency before there was any attempted catch-up in economic activity. So
did it ever work out at all? Did it work out at all in the end?
It depends upon whom you ask. In the aggregate, no. There was no question about that. And that's the whole issue with the supply side economics. It's designed to benefit the wealthy. Don't forget, we didn't tax the wealthy at all until the 1910s, and then we taxed them at an ungodly rate of like over 90%, and that stayed in place until after World War II. Don't forget, the wealthy were taxed very highly during World War II to produce the money needed to carry on the war. So we had like a 93-94% tax rate on the wealthy in the beginning of World War II just to finance the fighting. So it was very hard, once you get a tax rate that's that high in place, to get rid of it because it's there and people are depending on it. Now, if you go back to what the Kennedy and Johnson and Nixon administrations did with that type of economic activity, they brought the rates down after World War II because there was no need to keep them that high. But they still had a tax rate of 70% for the absolute highest brackets. And most millionaires were paying 50% of their of their income in taxes. So that's what set everybody off, is that they always felt that the well-heeled in this country were paying too much. And when Ronald Reagan came into office, he came in absolutely licking his wounds about all the money that he had to pay in taxes when he was a high-paid actor. And the first thing he did when he got in the White House was to change it. And that was one campaign promise that he kept.
Well, now, David Stockton, by the way, was Reagan's director of the Office of Management and Budget, so he largely endorsed and kind of was the architect of Reagan's trickle-down tax situation. That's
right. He was the man that was in charge of all of the thought processes that were part of the Reagan tax cuts, and only later, in the Reagan administration, perhaps even in the second term, did he finally admit that the tax cuts were not offset by spending cuts, and the result was to drive up the debt to levels that we had never seen before.
Now, you said there's a pattern between the Democrat and the Republican administrations in terms of budget deficits and tax policy.
Well, yeah. I mean, if you look at history from the past 70 years, the average is that 5 of 6 Democratic presidents have reduced the deficit during their terms. 6 of the 6 Republican presidents increased the deficit during their terms. Obama reduced it by 52% despite a very soft economy. Bush 43 increased the deficit by more than 900%, larger to pay for the wars. Clinton reduced the deficit by 160%. Bush 41 increased it by 63%. That's a holdover from the Reagan years. And Reagan increased the deficit by 24%. So it's very hard to argue that fiscal responsibility is on the side of the Republicans in this matter, because the facts bespeak that.
So is it really largely a political myth that Reagan actually bolstered the economy with his tax policies?
Well, I think it was proven that we wound up with massive deficits that started there. Bush 41 had his share of deficits, and only when he signed a revenue enhancement package midway through his midway through his term — he didn't have a first term, he only had one — did suddenly they realized that this was going to solve part of the problem. So Clinton comes into office and largely has great success in balancing the budget simply because of what Bush 41 did in terms of raising revenue in a quiet way so as not to get the Republicans tagged with a tax increase.
Well, he was roundly criticized by the GOP for reneging on his promise, his famous promise, no new taxes.
Read my lips, that's correct. Well, they tried to slip it through and call it something else, but it was the right thing to do at a time when the economy was perking. And in fact, it set the stage for all kinds of economic growth in the 90s, all the way through the Clinton administration. The economic growth in the country was very good. We had no recession, and Clinton left office with a surplus. So those are things that you can't dispute. Those numbers are there to look at, and anybody can argue about where and how that all occurred. But the fact remains is that the economic activity in the Clinton years was probably the best we've seen in the last 70 years.
And with Trump's tax proposals now, do you think that's heading in the same disastrous direction?
Probably even more so, because the wealth transfer that we've seen over the past 10 to 15 years with Republicans in control of Congress has been really outrageous. And all you have to do is listen to the talk masters on the right. The Rush Limbaughs of the world who say that, oh no, this is not about the wealth transfer. It's about economic activity. Nonsense. It's always been about wealth transfer, and it always will be about wealth transfer. And now you're even seeing people who are stepping up who are wealthy and saying, look, we don't need any more money. It's time to have some of it move to the actual middle class of this country by giving them tax breaks that they really need and can qualify for without having to do all sorts of hoop jumping to get into that tax bracket. So some millionaires in this country and billionaires in this country have finally gotten the message that they don't really need any more money, and that to homogenize all of that wealth at the high level ad infinitum is just silly and dangerous for the rest of the country.
As we speak, Trump is pushing hard for his tax plan, which appears to be getting close to the support needed, at least by some accounts. What's your prediction on that? Is it going to pass as he wants it to pass, or will it be largely watered down and not the kind of trickle-down Reagan style that we've seen before?
Well, there's a lot of things that are going to come into play here. If this vote does not occur before December 12th, which is the date of the Alabama runoff election for the Senate seat that Jeff Sessions vacated, Republicans could well lose a seat in the Senate, and a Democrat could be seated if this Roy Moore stuff continues to fester. So if the Republicans cannot get this thing passed before that election, and assuming that the Democrats do take the seat, that makes it even harder for them to deliver on any sort of tax bill, even if it doesn't have the repeal of Obamacare connected to it, which is what they want to do now. My suspicion is the Obamacare linkage is poison for this thing. It's been decided that 3 times now by a number of Republican moderates and even by some of the conservatives like Rand Paul that they couldn't vote for repeal of Obamacare because it didn't have enough in it. So depending on which side you're on, it doesn't matter where the negative votes come from on Obamacare. So to tie it to the tax bill is really poisonous, and I think that it's probably going to fall of its own weight.
All right, we'll see before too long. Talking today with long-time former AT newsman Bryant Thomas, speaking now from his home in New Hampshire. Brian, thanks for being with us, and we'll sure be talking a lot more about the economy in the weeks ahead. Thank you.